So now that we have our 2D game development project set up, let's go ahead and start getting some sprites. So the easiest way is to come on over to the asset store and then come into textures and materials. Now most people jump straight to the 2D and isometric stuff and start going through there. But you got to remember that a sprite is just a texture. So really any of these can do. So we could go ahead and grab a stone texture. Let's just look at the free ones for now. Let's go ahead and take one that we could use maybe for a floor. So we'll go ahead and import this texture here. And after we're done importing, if we go ahead and take a look at it, it's going to be set to the texture default. All we have to do is come in, set it to a sprite. We're going to go ahead and set that point filter. Hit apply, then we can go ahead and come into our scene and actually use it as a regular sprite. But let's go ahead and take a look at some of the sprite packages out there that we have on the asset store. Now, like I said, you don't have to use the asset store. There's a ton of free websites already online, like was it opengameart.org? It's pretty popular. If you've got one that you really like, go ahead and list it down below in the comments. I'm sure everyone else would like to know about it. So I am looking for a pack. So I'm going to go for the 2D and isometric ones. And I want free only. And what you're really looking for is just something that has a look and feel for the type of game that you want to create. This is great. This looks like it has stuff on all different layers for us. You'll probably spend quite a bit of time here going through all the different packages, trying to figure out which ones you like, which ones you don't. The only thing I warn you about is that while you're poking around on the Unity Asset Store, if you download a complete project, a lot of the times these complete projects have setting changes in your project. So it might add a few layers or it might change some of the settings in the background. So just be mindful of that. For now, I would just stick to importing textures. So regardless of the pack of textures that you find, or even if it's just individuals that you group together, there's a couple things you are going to want to make sure of just before you start using them. And that is to make sure that they are set to being a sprite. As far as the single mode goes, we're going to be looking at some stuff a little bit later on that has more than one sprite on a texture. Let me go down here and take a look. For instance, this sprite sheet, and that's a name you'll hear quite often. We've got a lot of enemies on here. And if we take a look, you know, we have block sad here. If we open it up here, we still have block sad here, but it's with a lot of other things. Now you might be wondering, why would we want to use a texture that has a bunch of sprites on it? And it's really just a matter of efficiency. Loading one larger texture into memory and just using parts of it is more efficient than loading up a bunch of smaller textures into memory. And at this stage, I wouldn't worry too much about if you're using individual sprites or sprites off of some other sprite sheet. As we go along, we'll learn how to go ahead and take the sprites that we want and create our own sprite sheets before we actually go ahead and get our game ready to be published. So again, I'm going to come back to one of the single sprites. This is a single, so we're going to leave it a single. A lot of these settings, if you hover over them, they'll tell you exactly what they do. And don't forget to also click on the book to read up on it. As Unity changes from version to version, even the minor versions, they add and remove stuff. And while I can update a video, it's just much easier to actually read the documentation. So the key things, pixels per unit, and that's just how many pixels you use per world unit inside of Unity. I'm just going to keep my meshes as tight. The pivot point, right now by default it's set to center, which obviously is the center of my sprite. And if I went ahead and rotate it, it would rotate around that pivot. So if I went ahead and moved the pivot out, let's say to the top, it would put the pivot point up here. So when I rotate it, it would rotate around here now. Likewise, if I put it on the left, it would rotate around here. You get the idea, right? The wrap mode, we want to set to clamp. We're not going to be repeating with it. And the filter mode, we do not need one for sprites. Let's go ahead and set it to point and you'll get a better quality picture out of it. Now take note down here, the resolution is 51 by 51 and it says that it's not a power of 2. And because of that, we can't use certain compression formats. You can come down into the defaults and set it to something that is a power of 2. So if you want 64 by 64, it still doesn't work because it's only 51 by 51. You have to go smaller. And when you hit apply, it'll go ahead and you won't get that complaint anymore. But anyway, I'm going to leave everything at the default settings as far as down here for the different platforms. I don't want to play around with that. What I do want to do is go ahead and jump into a sprite sheet. This is done. We can actually go ahead, drag this into our scene, and just start using it. But let's go ahead and look at that sprite sheet. So sprite sheet, same thing. We want to make sure it's a sprite. This time we want to set it to a multiple because we have multiple ones on there. I'm still going to keep the same pixels per inch, or sorry, per unit. Keep them tight, clamp, and we want to switch to point. I'll go ahead, hit apply. And let's go ahead and click on the sprite editor. And it's going to open up that texture for us here. Now the whole point of this is to go ahead and carefully cut out each individual sprite, or sorry, slice out each individual sprite. And there's a lot of ways to do that. I'm sure everyone's seen a sprite sheet where maybe it's a character animation and they've got them running. We come up here and take the slice. There's three options. We can do grid by cell size. So if we went ahead and did 64 by 64, set the pivots to 0. Don't worry about the offset and the padding. Go ahead and hit slice. And if we had an actual sprite here, or an image that we're converting to a sprite, that's great. You're going to see a lot of sprite sheets set up that way. Usually the character animations. Another popular one is by grid cell count. And here you're just setting the number of rows and columns. So let's say, I don't know, 3 columns by 2 rows. And again, we're not going to play with any of the offset or the padding. I'll keep the pivot to the center, hit slice, and there we go. We got 3 by 2. But for this one here, I am going to use automatic. And what that does is it lets Unity go ahead and slice it up as best as it can. It doesn't always get it perfect, but it's a good place to start. So again, my pivot points are going to be at 0. I'm not going to bother playing with it. Well, you can play with custom pivot if you want. I'm not going to. By default, I'll have all of them be at 0. For the method, delete existing. That means if you already have some slices going on, delete them. So we'll go ahead, we'll hit slice, and we see that it went ahead and sliced everything up. Looks like it did a pretty good job. I don't see anything off the top of my head that it messed up. But let's say it did mess up. Let's take this one here. We go ahead and click any of the actual sprites. It'll show you them. And you get some information here. We'll look at that in a second. Let's say it went ahead and it messed something up. And it came out like that. We're like, whoa, that one's not right. Or even in some instances, it might not be there at all. But if it messes one up, we can come in, just select one of the blue lines. Move it in. Scrolling the mouse wheel will zoom you in and out. Holding the middle mouse button down, you can pan around. And all you really want to do is just go ahead and match it up. There we go, we're good. So what happens if it's completely missing one, or it's messed one up so bad you just want to get rid of it? You can hold Command or Control, and then just hit Delete to get rid of it. But now we don't have this guide one, so how do we get them there? Well, just estimate where you want to start it and hold the mouse button down and just kind of go over it. And likewise, I didn't do a very good job here, so we're going to go ahead, move it up. We'll grab this one here. We're going to move it over, zoom in as much as you need. That looks good. And I'm going to come up to the top. And I needed the top pixel as well, so great. That should be enough to actually get you out and slicing up most sprite sheets. Let's come down here and look at the information of it. Now the first thing is the name. Well, if you have a sprite sheet that only has 4 or 5 sprites on it, and these are the only sprites you're using in your game, sure, you can just leave the default set name. In this case, it's usually the name of the sprite sheet and the number of the sprite on that sheet. So the stuff starts off at 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You get the idea, right? 6. Whoops. I'll go ahead and hit apply. Just jump back into that. I'm at 6, but you get the idea, right? The naming convention is just on a grid. It just keeps going across. Next, we get the position of the first corner here, the top left, on the total texture, which is 255 by 7. Then, of course, we're going to get a width and a height attached to that. We don't have any borders, but we'll get into those a little bit later. We don't really need to mess with the borders right now. Now, the pivot point. For the majority of these, I want the pivot point to be exactly where it is. Well, let's say for these tall orange guys, I want to move the pivot point down here. I can just click on it and drag it to where I want it to be. And let's say when this guy walks, I kind of want him to sway back and forth a bit. I can drag it to where I want. I can type in to be a little bit more precise, or I can come in and just take one of the presets. In this case, it puts it right at the bottom in the center. I'm going to do the same for this guy. So now when I'm animating this guy and I want him to rotate, I can rotate him around that pivot point. So after you're done all this, there's a little apply button up here. Go ahead, click that. We're done. And when we open it up, now because I did not rename any of those sprites, it's actually quite a mess in here. And some of these sprites actually form an animation. So sprite 6 and 0 are part of the flight animation for this fly. And we'll get into animations a little bit later. But because I did not order them, did not name them, they're sorted alphabetically. So let's actually go ahead and rename some of these. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the sprite sheet itself, go back in, and let's just rename the fly ones. So I'm going to call it Fly 1. Call this one Fly 2. And I do advise actually naming them. It takes a bit of time, but it pays off in the end. And here we go. Now instead of being 0 and 6, they're Fly 1 and Fly 2. That's all we really need to cover as far as learning how to work with sprites and sprite sheets, especially with the sprite editor. So I'll see you in the next video where we go ahead and start playing around with sorting layers. So if you like the video, go ahead and hit that subscribe button down below. It really does help me out here on YouTube. And go ahead and follow me on Twitter. I can be a pretty chatty guy over there when I'm not walking through a forest or being stalked by eagles and falcons, lions, tigers, and bears.